The idea or concept of a cluster is a group of objects that can cooperate and work more closely with each other. For example, if we create a cluster, so we've got our Las Vegas data center, and at the moment, each of these ESXi hosts is logically in that Las Vegas data center directly. And if we want to do things like vMotion, for example, take a virtual machine from ESXi2 and move it to a new compute resource like ESXi3, we'd right-click on that VM and specify that we want to move it. Or if we want to create a new VM, we specify the ESXi host that it's supposed to run on. If we increase the teamwork, if you will, between these ESXi hosts, we can go ahead and create a logical cluster for the ESXi hosts. We can place each of the 3 ESXi hosts into that cluster, and as a result, we can enable additional features. One of those features is the feature called DRS. It stands for Distributed Resource Scheduler. And what DRS can do for us, it can take a look at the ESXi hosts that are combined in that cluster and see which ones are busiest. And so if we want to start a new VM, it can go ahead and place the VM that we want to start on the least busy ESXi host. Or if we have a whole bunch of VMs that are running on ESXi2 and ESXi3, and they all of a sudden start to get busy, the Distributed Resource Scheduler can automatically move a VM off of ESXi2, for example, over to a less busy ESXi host. Another benefit of having a cluster, besides having Distributed Resource Scheduler available to us, is that we also have additional features that we can add on as well, including high availability. We'll have a separate nugget on that, and also Virtual Storage Area Network, or vSAN. So initially, what I want to walk us through is simply creating a cluster, moving 3 ESXi hosts into that cluster, and then demonstrating how the DRS feature can be used to help distribute the load more evenly across our ESXi hosts. Here in the vSphere web client, let's go ahead and click on the Host and Clusters tab if it's not already selected, and click on the Las Vegas Data Center. Now, at the data center level, it's providing an overview of the resources in that data center, including the number of hosts, the networks involved, the data stores involved, and over here it has a nice overview regarding utilization. If we take each of these ESXi hosts and we expand them, it'll show us the virtual machines that are currently associated with each of those ESXi hosts. So at the moment, we've got our vCenter server appliance that's currently running on ESXi1, and we've got a couple VMs associated with ESXi2 and a couple more associated with ESXi3. If we want to have a better team approach, and we can start that by creating a cluster for our hosts, what we would do is we'd right-click on the data center, and from the menu, simply select New Cluster. We'd give it a name. Let's call it Cluster-1 in the event we have multiple clusters of ESXi hosts. And there are several features that we can enable on this cluster. For now, let's go ahead and enable DRS, Distributed Resource Scheduler, and it's asking us about the automation level. Manual simply means that DRS is going to make recommendations, and we can accept them if we want to. The next option we have is partially automated. And with partially automated, when we actually start a virtual machine, it can place that VM on the least busy host to go ahead and start it up. But after that, it won't move VMs that get really busy or if there's an imbalance regarding CPU resources. It's only initially. And then fully automated, when we start a virtual machine, it'll place it on an ESXi host that's least busy, and it will also automatically balance for us and move a VM from one ESXi host to another to help get a better balance of resource utilization across the ESXi hosts that are in the cluster. Now, this also implies, regarding the DRS feature, that we have vMotion currently set up and working, which we do. We've tested that in a previous nugget. And with vSphere DRS, we're just talking about moving the VM to a different compute resource, a different ESXi host. There's another feature, which we'll talk about in another nugget, called Storage DRS, which does the equivalent, but regarding data stores. So here we're just focused on straight up vSphere DRS, moving VMs across ESXi host for their compute resources. So in the lab, I'm going to select Manual for the automation level, and I'd like you to do the same when you do the hands-on lab, and that way we can see the recommendations and actually allow the recommendations, and not just have it go crazy in the background, moving VMs around. Also, we have a migration threshold. If we want it to be as aggressive as possible, we can set it all the way up to a 5, and it's going to be more aggressive to go ahead and get the balance regarding VMs and the ESXi host to have an even distribution about utilization on those hosts. If we slide it all the way over to conservative, which is a 1, it's only going to make a recommendation, for example, about moving a running VM if there's a serious imbalance. So for the lab, I'm going to leave it as aggressive and manual, meaning it'll only tell us about the recommendations, and we'll have to go ahead and approve them. Also, for the moment, we're going to leave the vSphere high availability, the enhanced vMotion compatibility, and also the vSend feature all turned off. We're just focused on DRS at this moment, and we'll click on OK. And now you'll notice that we have this brand new cluster up here in the data center. Our next step is to move our ESXi hosts into that cluster, which is really easy to do. We'll just click and drag. So we'll click on ESXi1 and drag it on top of cluster 1. The little green plus symbol indicates that's a OK place to drop it. We'll let go of the mouse, give it a few moments to think about that, and it's giving us a pop-up saying, do you want to put all of this host's virtual machines in the cluster's root resource pool? So when we create the cluster, we can think of it as a logical pool of resources. And effectively, we're putting all of the compute and memory resources on ESXi1 into that cluster. So as we add more and more ESXi hosts into the cluster is going to have more and more resources to allocate to VMs that want to run and be supported by that cluster. So we're going to take the top radio button, put all the host virtual machines in the cluster's root resource pool, and click OK. And now that that's done, we'll do the same thing for ESXi2. We'll drag and drop it up into the cluster. We'll click on OK for that, and then we'll drag and drop ESXi3 into the cluster as well. And click on OK. So now you'll notice that if we expand this cluster, it's showing all these VMs. Now if we look at the properties for these VMs, they are going to have details regarding which ESXi host they want to run on. For example, if we click on VM-1 and click on the Summary tab, it's still indicating that it's ESXi2, and the same for VM2. And then for VMs 3 and 4, if we looked at their details, they would be indicating that they want to run on ESXi3. And what I'd like to do, and this isn't very nice, but what I would like to do is let's go ahead and do a migration of all of these virtual machines over to ESXi1, and we'll just load them up. So currently ESXi1 is running the vCenter server appliance, and it's about to be supporting additionally 4 more VMs. So there's several ways of doing the migrate. We could right click on each of these VMs and from the menu select migrate, or we could go ahead and click on the VMs and templates icon here, this tab, and click on our VMs folder. And then over here we have the summary tab. We also have a VMs tab. Let's click on that. And what we could do is we could go ahead and click on VM1 to highlight it, hold down the shift key, click on VM4 so that they're all highlighted, and then we can right click. And here for actions, it says 4 virtual machines. Whatever we're about to do, we're going to apply it to all 4. And from here, we can select migrate. And it says, do you want to perform this action on 4 objects? We'll say yes. And we're going to go ahead and change the compute resources for all 4 of those. We'll click on next. It's asking us, okay, who's the lucky host? It's going to be ESXi1. We'll click on next. And the purpose we're doing this for is to create an imbalance once we power on all these VMs. It's asking us about the networking for those 4 VMs. All those VMs were coming from a distributed switch port group, and we're going to land them on the new ESXi host and use the same exact port group. So with that in place, we'll click on next, and then we'll go ahead and click on finish. And because these machines are not running, and we're not moving the storage, we're just simply moving the compute resource, it is done, and that's being reflected right here. We could also go ahead and we could right click on the header and click from the drop down show/hide columns, and we could include any columns that we want. And we could also move columns around. For example, we could move this column over just by dragging it over and letting go of the mouse, and that would put it there. So let's go ahead and power on each of these virtual machines. We can just click on, for example, VM1, click on the power icon to power it on. And now, this is DRS making a recommendation. And here's the recommendation. It's recommending that we use ESXi2 as the host and not ESXi1 because ESXi1 is already running the vCenter server appliance and consuming a lot of resources on ESXi1. So we could accept that, or we could click on this second checkbox and put a check in that second box that indicates, nah, we want to put it on ESXi1. So this is DRS trying to avoid an overload of resources on ESXi1, but we're not buying in. We're simply going to go ahead and put it where we want it. We'll click on OK. And that virtual machine is off to the races. Also, if we clicked on VM2 and we held down the shift key and clicked on VM4 and highlighted all those, we could go ahead and click on start here. And what DRS is doing again is saying, you know what, ESXi1 is pretty busy. Why don't we put VM2 on host 2, VM3 on host 3, and VM4 on host 2? What do you say? And as a result of trying to power on all those VMs at once, there's no other option here. I basically have to hit cancel and then simply start them up one at a time. So I'm going to do these manually, one by one. We'll right click on VM2 over here in the inventory, select power, we'll do power on. It's giving us the recommendation for ESXi2. I'm going to go ahead and not choose that. I'm going to go ahead and put it back on ESXi1. Click on OK, and we'll follow that same process for 3 and 4. So we'll right click on VM3, go to power, and click power on. We'll thank DRS for the recommendation, but we'll go ahead and put it back on ESXi1, click OK, and we'll repeat that process for VM4. I have had occasion where I right clicked on a virtual machine and it only gave me one option. It didn't give me the option to put it back on ESXi1. So if that happens to you in this column, you can just right click over here on the inventory on that VM, click on power on, and hopefully it'll give you both options. So there's its recommendation, and I'm going to choose the bottom one to go ahead and put it on ESXi1, and we'll click OK. So we'll give that a moment to refresh, and I'm going to take the host CPU column and move it over here a little bit. I'm also going to hit F11 to take this out of full screen mode, and let's open up consoles to all those devices, to VM1 and VM2. And then for VM3, let's open a console, and we'll also do that same thing for VM4, just to make sure that they're all running and they've got the desktop and everything else. So it looks good. Looks like all 4 virtual machines are currently up and running. Fantastic. So somebody's not happy about this, and actually 2 people. One is ESXi1 is like, hey, how come I got to handle all these VMs? I'm pretty busy. And the other person that's not too happy is DRS, Distributed Resource Scheduler, because we didn't follow any of its recommendations. So if we were to go back to the Host and Clusters tab right here, let's click on that and click on the cluster. Now it's showing the utilization across the cluster. And regarding this cluster, if we click on the Monitor tab right here, and then on these sub buttons down here, if we click on VSPHERE DRS, the first option here is recommendations. Here are all the recommendations that it currently has for us. It's saying, hey, we can move VM4 over to ESXi3, and that's based on CPU utilization. And maybe we can move VM1 and 3 and 2 over to ESXi2, 3, and 2 respectively to balance the memory loads. So it's giving us the recommendation and why. And it does that DRS check periodically. If we wanted to force a DRS check, we could click on this button here, Run DRS Now. And if there's any additional recommendations, they would show up right here. So with the cluster selected on the left, the Monitor tab selected here, and then this VSPHERE DRS subtab or button selected, let's go ahead and select CPU utilization. And so what this is showing us, it's showing us that ESXi1, and we could hover over these as well. ESXi1 has all these virtual machines that are using resources on it, and ESXi2 and ESXi3 have nothing. No VMs running whatsoever. So from a CPU perspective, as we hover over these, this first one represents VM4, and this next one is VM1, and then we have VM2, and then we have the vCenter Server Appliance, which at the moment isn't using a ton of CPU. However, when that vCenter Server Appliance boots up, it pegs the CPU on all cylinders for like 4 to 5 minutes as it initializes. So now that it's settled, it's not using a whole bunch of CPU. If we go down and click on memory utilization, that's another story. Most of the memory on ESXi1 is being chewed up and consumed by the vCenter Server Appliance. So if we wanted to go ahead and allow DRS to do its job, we could go back to Recommendations, and we're going to click on Run DRS Now, just to make sure we have the latest and greatest. So now it's recommending 3 VMs that should be moved. We'll click on Apply Recommendations, and we'll click on Recent Tasks, and it's moving 3 VMs, VM2, 3, and 4. And it's done. So we'll go ahead and minimize Recent Tasks. And now that it's done, if we go back to CPU utilization and click on Refresh, we now have a more even distribution of those resources. And for a little bit of fun, check this out. This guy right here, as we hover over this space, that is VM1. So if we were to cause VM1 to get really, really CPU intensive and busy, it's very likely that DRS is going to trigger again and make a recommendation for us to move VM1 off of ESXi1. So let's go to the tab for VM1, and let's click on the little mouse in the upper left-hand corner. Let's open up a terminal window, and let's type in GLX gears. And this is a little graphic utility. It's built into this distribution of Linux. We'll press Enter, and I'll move it over here, again, so you can see that command as well. Because when you do the hands-on lab, I'd like you to practice this. So GLX gears, and then it's going to report the frames per second. Now what this is doing is, because the entire virtual machine is virtualized, and the ESXi host is providing all the resources for this, it's using a ton of resources. So if we clicked on the mouse again, for example, and clicked on Terminal Emulator one more time, and we typed in top and pressed enter, let me go ahead and bring this down just a little bit. I want to be able to see the gears as well. So feel free to move this around anywhere you want when you do the lab. And you'll see here we have a fairly high utilization rate regarding the virtual CPU associated with this virtual machine. So we're going to let that run, and let's go back to the vSphere web client. And with the cluster still selected, with the monitor tab and the vSphere DRS, let's click on refresh. And so here on CPU utilization, you'll notice that we're using quite a bit more CPU utilization. So my guess is this is still VM1. We can hover over that to be sure. And then if we click on recommendations, it's now recommending that we move VM1 from ESXi1 over to ESXi2. So if we click on apply recommendations, it'll go ahead and do a vMotion for that VM to more evenly balance the resources that are available from the host in the cluster. And then if we click on history, it'll show us the history. And if we go back to CPU utilization and click on refresh, we can see that VM1, which is chewing up quite a bit of CPU, is now here on ESXi2. And if we go to the right just a little bit and hover, this little teeny sliver is VM2. We could also just click on the VMs tab right here. And then if we want to see what host they're running on, we could right click in the header and then click on show/hide columns. And then we could click on the host, click on OK, and then scroll to the right and drag that host column over where we can actually see it. And then we can scroll back to the left. So VM2, which is not very busy, let's go ahead. In fact, for VM2, it shows the host CPU as 0 megahertz. Either it's a miscalculation, which might be attributed to nested virtualization, which we're doing to make this all possible, or VM2 may be dead. So let's click on VM2, and let me close that tab, and let me try to reopen a console to VM2. So with VM2 selected, we'll click Open Console, and there it is. So it's not dead, but we'll make him more busy. We'll click on the mouse, click on Terminal Emulator, and in the Terminal Emulator, we'll type in GLX gears once again, which will launch that application, which will take a lot of CPU for that virtual machine. We'll go back to the vSphere web client, click on refresh, and it's still showing the host CPU 0 megahertz. That number in a normal environment should increase to represent what that virtual machine is actually doing. So we'll give it a moment. We'll click on refresh, and that looks better. So it's climbing. So regarding the exact calculation it's using, it's probably using some type of an average over some short period of time. So I imagine that over time, as we continue to click refresh and we leave that gear application running, that number will increase. All right, so if we go back to monitor and we click on the vSphere DRS and CPU utilization, let's go ahead and do a refresh to make sure we're looking at the latest and greatest. It's very likely that we're going to have a recommendation to move one of these two virtual machines, the two that are running the gear application, off of ESXi2. And to see the recommendation, we'll simply click on recommendations, click on run DRS. There's a recommendation, which is to migrate VM2 off of ESXi2 and move it over to ESXi3. We'll click on apply recommendations and let it do that. And then if we go down to CPU utilization once more, we have a much better distribution CPU-wise than we did previously. If we go to memory utilization, this is the memory that's being consumed by the vCenter server appliance, and the other memory on ESXi2 and ESXi3 are from the little Linux VMs that we're currently running. And look at this. Over here on the left, VM1 has an alert, and check this out, it's virtual machine CPU usage. And that's because it's been extremely high ever since we started running that little gear application. So regarding VM1, if we click on monitor and click on issues and go to all issues, here we have the issue of virtual machine CPU usage. We have a triggered alarm, and if we want to, we can right click on that alarm and either acknowledge it or reset it to green, which means, hey, forget it. But if we have that application running and it's using all that CPU, it's very likely that that alarm is going to trigger again. So let's do this. Let's go back to our cluster on the left-hand side. We'll click on the VMs tab. Let's highlight VM1, hold the Shift key, click on VM4 so that all 4 VMs are highlighted, and we'll click on Shutdown to gracefully shut down. And because they all have the VMware tools, it's not going to be a problem. So we'll click on Yes, and that will gracefully shut down all 4 VMs. I'm also going to close the tabs for them up here. We can go to the recent tasks and verify that the shutdown has been at least initiated from a vCenter perspective. And if we go back to our VMs tab here and click on refresh, and there we go. So they're all powered off. And just for grins, with those 4 VMs all highlighted, let's right click, let's select migrate, we'll click on yes, and we'll migrate them all back to ESXi1. We'll click on next. We can click on ESXi1, but check this out. Now that we have the cluster in place, we could just click on the clusters button and say, you know what, go ahead and put them in cluster 1 anywhere you want in cluster 1. And that way it can just find the appropriate resources to run those VMs across the cluster as a pool of resources. However, for this demonstration, what I'd like to do is let's force everything back on ESXi1. So we'll select ESXi1, click on next. We'll leave the networking the same, click next, and click on finish. So now all these VMs are associated with ESXi1. So if we modify the DRS parameters by right-clicking on the cluster, and from the Actions menu click on Settings, it basically takes us to the cluster, to the Configure tab. So under Services we have vSphere DRS. Here we can click on Edit. And then for the DRS automation, we can go ahead and specify we want it fully automated and click on OK. So now if we go back to our virtual machines, we'll click on the VMs tab. And with all of them highlighted, we'll go ahead and click Power On. You'll notice that it's automatically placing them on various ESXi hosts so that ESXi1 doesn't have to carry all that burden of all those VMs. So if we click on refresh here, all those machines are powering up, and only one of them, which was VM3, got placed on ESXi1, and the other 3 VMs got placed on other ESXi hosts other than ESXi1. So now, my friend, it is your opportunity to do a little practice with Distributed Resource Scheduler by creating a cluster, putting your host into that cluster, launching VMs, and working with either the recommendations from DRS or setting it to fully automated as we just did, and simply sit back and watch it do its magic. So have some fun with the lab, and I'll see you in the next nugget. Meanwhile, I hope this has been informative for you, and I'd like to thank you for viewing.